Well, good morning. Come on. Who was on the 6 a.m. shuttle from the party this morning? Oh my gosh. Morning. Thank you so much. It's great having you all here, and I want to thank the KnowledgeAdvisor folks for the invitation to host the panel today. I'm honored to be on the stage with my distinguished colleagues, humbled in fact, three folks I've admired in their work, so we're very excited to hear from all of them. We're going to try something a little different in our format today, in that we have a number of questions we're going to go through. We've been on the phone and talked. We would love to kind of open this up to question as we go, as well as Q&A at the end. So as we're going along, by all means, as we get to a particular question or area, I'm going to pause for a second, give panelists a chance to get a drink or water, and relax a little bit, but scan the crowd and see if there are any questions, and we'll go from there. Fair? Okay, welcome. So what we're going to do to get started, my friends, is we're going to have them introduce themselves, and I'm also going to make them multitask. We're going to have them answer their first question at the same time. Jeffrey, to your point about getting started, when I was first introduced to measurement, one of the first things I was taught was you can't measure everything, nor should you measure everything, right? So the theme of our talk is strategic programs. So what I'd love to have you do is introduce yourself, of course, we go across, and then in your words, what defines a strategic program from maybe one that's not? What are the criteria that it makes something worth looking at? Fair? So okay. Patty, why don't we start with?
Okay, good. I'm Patty Phillips, President and CEO of the ROI Institute. And I define a strategic program as any program that has a direct connection to those strategic objectives. So it's clearly aligned with whatever the strategic goals, strategic objectives the organization is trying to accomplish. That whether it's building competencies to increase market share, whatever it is, that ultimate payoff opportunity is clearly connected.
Great, thank you.
Michelle Graham with KPMG, and similar definition for us, as Patty mentioned. It's really those programs that are aligned to the business leader's goals and outcomes that they're looking for in the business, and also those programs that are tied to strategic initiatives within the organization. So it can be something that isn't costly, but as long as it's aligned to the direction the business is going in, that's where we still consider it a strategic program. So it's not always about costs, where I think some organizations get caught up in that.
Kendall Kerekes, Vice President of KnowledgeAdvisors for Human Capital. I would say I would look at it a little bit differently. So in addition to what they've shared, I would say that one of the key components is actually solving a business problem that impacts the organization as a whole. So when you're looking at something, I mean, how many people does it touch, and what is the magnitude of the business problem that this training is supposed to be kind of mitigating in some senses? So I would say in alignment with the strategic vision, definitely, and in alignment with the business unit goals, but when it has a very broad impact and it has the line of sight of your CEO and your executives, and it's a very large pain point for that organization across business units. Great,
great. So you've got that program that you've decided to focus on. What would you say then, in your experience, is the key component of a measurement plan around a program like that? Want to start?
You want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, I think the key component is the alignment piece. A lot of times we jump into programs and we say, okay, it's a strategic program, yet that program's not tied to any business objective, no payoff opportunity. In theory it is. You ultimately want to increase that market share, improve customer satisfaction. But when you're looking at the program itself and the objectives for the program, those measures aren't there. It's not tied to it. So I think a critical part of a strategic program is that alignment piece, getting clear on what the stakeholders need, getting clear on the payoff opportunity, the specific business measures that need to improve, and then tying whatever the competencies are that you're trying to develop to those objectives, and not just throwing out there, and then designing those programs around those critical objectives, and then of course evaluating accordingly.
Yeah, I think it's tying it to first starting with the outcomes that you expect to have in the business, but also making sure that you have a mixed method approach in your evaluation plan. I think a lot of times we get stuck in one particular method, but the methods need to match what those outcomes are. So you don't have to do sometimes a full study start to finish and calculate ROI as well. Along with that, sometimes it really is knowledge transfer that they're looking for. So you can align your methods to what that outcome is. But it's really making sure that you use mixed methods as well. It doesn't just have to be survey data as well. It can be things like qualitative information that you're gathering as well. So match the methods to those outcomes that are expected.
Yeah, I would say for us, we do a lot of work in what we often do with the measurement strategies. We start with something called a logic modeling session. And it really starts with the alignment. You're starting to make sure that also everybody is in agreement with what are the outcomes and what is the impact that this particular program is intended to have across your executive team for strategic programs. And really gaining insight into the mixed methodology, but then also having, kind of those critical milestones of when behavior and when major things are supposed to be happening. That's where you're putting your measurement components in, where you're collecting data to determine whether or not things are shifting, and that you've got a little bit of a blend of, you've got some of that longitudinal to where, some of the statistical analysis and some of those things are a bit more long-term. So collecting data iteratively, but then also kind of doing that more strategic in those more long-term longitudinal studies, but doing them in tandem so that you've got data that's going to your executives as you're looking at kind of the more sophisticated measurement components kind of throughout.
I think that's a good point, because I think it's important to make sure you define up front to who your stakeholders are.
Yep.
As you mentioned, reporting to your executives, who are you reporting that information to, and at what points in time do they need the information?
Yep.
So really defining that up front helps you determine when you need to have data reported on, when you need to have it collected by, et cetera. It helps the planning process.
Yep. Yeah, I would say that's a pretty critical piece to where one of the key questions that we've really started to ask is, what are you on the hook for? Your key executive stakeholders, what are you on the hook for, and what are the questions that you need? Do you have a board meeting that's coming up? Do you have budgeting that's coming up? Do you have, what is that moment where you're going to need data, and what is the data that you need to start informing some of those decisions? Because sometimes your timeline from a measurement strategy does not sync up to the timeline of the business unit.
Yep. Good.
Great. Questions? Clarifications? You all right?
I need some coffee.
Is everybody awake?
Coffee.
Yeah, you still there?
Coffee.
Refill on coffee?
Yeah, good. Okay, we do. We have one over here if we could, please.
Thanks. So how do you do that when, so the organization I work for is very immediate. They're in a sales business, so they want to know that the training we performed yesterday has an immediate impact on results tomorrow. So how do you sort of reset or reframe people's thinking of when the finish line is, and then when to start measuring it?
So the question is, if the program has already been implemented and now they want to tie it, is that what I'm
No, so even at the beginning when we're starting the conversation around how we'll measure it, I mean, the expectation is, okay, you've just come out of sales training, so your sales are going to be better, right? And obviously there's a sales cycle that people need to go through, as well as their learning cycle. So how do you sort of reframe their thinking as to, okay, this is going to have an immediate impact on your results?
So you're saying that they want to know immediately that the training had an instant impact, when really you need some time to be able to show that they were able to implement the skills and then determine what the impact was.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question.
Does anyone want to?
Yeah, well,
Go ahead.
no, well, I mean, it's a great question, because you have to show the true impact. We have to wait to see what happens with those measures. So what do you do in the interim? And of course, there are a lot of measures that you can take during the interim. We can use utility analysis, for example, to project where we're going to go with those sales data, for example. So take those shorter term measures to see what are people doing with what they learned in the program. I think the key is making sure that what you're teaching them to do in the program is aligned with whatever that business measure is, and that's where we often miss the mark. We think this program is set up to drive sales, but yet it's not at all. And so I think step one is go back and look at what were we really trying to do with the program, and then see if it's being deployed and implemented the way you expected to, and take the shorter term look at it. So there are some things you can do in the short term while you wait to see if those sales increase. The key there, though, is the longer we wait to see if sales increase, the harder it's going to be to tie it back to the program, and that gets to isolating the effects of the program. So when we set up our programs, again, it gets back to the objectives of the program, developing those objectives and saying in 3 months, we're going to see where we are. That becomes your timing, and everyone agrees to that. And then if we don't have that, you know, you may have a longer term check, but you always want to be able to tie it back to that particular program. And I think when we set it up at the outset, you know what your sales cycle is going to be. Of course, everything in hindsight is always 20/20, but at the very beginning, when you're looking at that initial scan, that initial needs analysis, you know, how long is that sales cycle, and you plan accordingly so you can put those intermediate measures and checkpoints in there.
And one of the things that, you know, we've worked hard to do, because we do, our clients at least always want that instant response similar to what you're talking about, is add questions to our surveys immediately after a course that are predictive in nature, so that they're asking the individuals at that point in time, did you learn new knowledge and skills from this? Can you apply it on your job? Is your job performance going to improve as a result of this? What's going to improve? Is it the quality of your work, your ability to sell? You know, and you can customize some of those questions to meet your business and your objectives. But what we have then been able to do, once you get some of that information, if you do that follow-up, you can tie those back to those initial survey results. So you don't have to do that every time. We've been able to show in some studies that that predicts what actually does happen. People are really good for us in our organization at predicting immediately after a course what they're actually going to do once they get back on the job. So it allows us to validate that instantly and be able to confidently say, this is going to have an impact here, and this is what it's going to be. And hey, by the way, 6 months from now, 3 months from now, we can go back and give you some additional data as to what the percentage of impact really was.
And to build on that, what we work when we're working with clients, what we also have them do, while you have your standard questions of relevance, importance, intent to use, what we'll also have them do is identify specifically what are you going to do. You know, tell us exactly what you plan to do, by when, and that becomes your touch point. That becomes the follow-up.
Yeah, and I think it's also, you know, a common conversation is it's time versus accuracy. If they want, and that's where you get into the roughly reasonable, so where the nice part about this survey in the predictive and the estimation of asking them right after something has closed, or, you know, 15 days after they're back on the job, they should know. I mean, 15 days, and part of the logic is, you know, and some people really challenge the validity of survey data of saying, hey, you know what, these folks they're not really going to tell us the truth. But you know, the mindset is, you know, these are the folks, and these are your subject matter experts that you're working with because they know the job. These are the people that you work with to help build the program. Why wouldn't that be the same population to help you evaluate whether or not it's working? So that's where it's like they're good enough to be your subject matter experts. They're good enough to tell you whether or not it's actually going to be doing something and improving performance. But it does go back to estimation. You leverage your survey data. You get some insight from them immediately. But you also start having the question of its time and accuracy. Do you need the data fast, or do you need the data right? And if they need 100% accuracy in that statistical analysis to where you're at that, you know, nth degree, it's going to take time. If you want it tomorrow, then you're going to be that roughly reasonable 80% of the way estimation. You're going to do, you know, some predictive analytics.
Yeah. And I think an important point to keep in mind, and Kendall brought it up, you're never going to be 100% accurate.
Right.
Ever.
Right.
Ever. And we had this conversation a little bit yesterday in the session. You know, we live in a world of estimates. It is a way of life. The question is, how do you manage it? Okay, and it gets back to, you know, timing. You're always balancing accuracy and cost.
Yep.
All roads lead to ROI, bottom line, okay? It's always about benefits and cost, and that's how we work. You are never going to get it 100% right. The question is, can you get it right enough to make a decision about the program?
Right.
Are you generating usable information that people can use in their decision-making process? And that is all we can do.
It's reasonable confidence is what we talk about with our clients.
Yeah.
Are you reasonably confident in the information we're able to provide you with? And if we're not confident in that, then we'll try and think about other methods and other ways we can get that information. But it's how much evidence can we get so that we're reasonably confident in what we're saying.
Yeah. And as Michelle pointed out earlier, you know, mixed method approach is becoming really important in organizations now, because that qualitative look at the statistical data gives you a little more information. So what we're doing a lot of is the sequential exploratory, sequential explanatory, where we either go in up front, do our focus groups, find out what's going on with the program. When you don't know what you don't know, let's go ask. And then develop survey data based on that, or on the back side, get your data from the survey and then go talk to some people and say, what does this really mean?
Yeah, and for our most strategic programs, we do go on site at those programs if it's a live program in person, and we'll do focus groups with the population who are taking the course. that last day of the program and really get their feedback at that point in time to say, what were the strengths of this? Where do you think you're going to have challenges when you get back to the field and put this into practice? How do you think you're going to be able to put this into practice, et cetera? So that helps us get some of that information too to validate the survey data that we're also collecting.
Yeah, and you also need to get, I mean, one of the key components too is that I think a lot of the measurement experts, they assume that they know the type of data that your executive stakeholders want to see. And it's a valid question to say, are you an engineering background where you need that statistical analysis and you need that, you know, that rigor, or do you just want to not be flying blind and I can get you stuff so that you can make a very, you know, a better decision because you have some data versus nothing? And the majority of your executives are going to say, just give me something. I want something. It doesn't need to be 100% there. Just give me something that I can start making decisions off of. But we often assume that they need this rigor, that they're looking at you going, I just need something. Give me something from these guys so I can start making some practical decisions.
I'm going to actually, a wonderful question, and actually, if you don't mind, guys, kind of reverse ones we talked about, because I think this leads into one we have on our list, which is, you know, we're in the L&D business. Most of us, that's our first job, but evaluation is in many organizations, it's not understood by those who we are going. You guys are using a lot of terms, causation and all these things that are not native to lines of business, folks. And so I think part of that question comes from the fact that they don't understand evaluation as a science and as a part of what we do, right? So they're asking questions based on not understanding the idea of having some time and that type of thing. Share with our group the importance of a communication plan, the importance of change management, which is what we're talking about around effective evaluation. It's one thing to have all these tools and such, but as we all know, to use evaluation right, there's a learning curve involved here. There's an understanding of why it's important and the logistics of weighting and such. In your experience with key programs, the value of a communication plan, the value of change management, where does it sit? What have you done?
I think it's huge. I think that's one of the most important things we do in that process, once we define who those stakeholders are, is really talking through, you know, how much knowledge they have and appetite they have for the evaluation data we're going to give them. Are these folks who are going to understand data and analysis? What type of language we have to put our reports into? And we actually create that plan up front to say, okay, here's who it's going to. This is the type of report that they need to get and the type of language they need to see in those reports so that it does tie back to exactly what they want. And change management was huge when we started. We didn't start doing everything. We didn't start with an ROI study and go out there and say, here's what it says, although we might have, Patty, I'm not sure we might have.
I think you did.
But part of that suddenly was like, okay, they can't digest this now.
Right,
We gave them too much information. I think it was a good point to step back and say, okay, let's get the basics right first, and let's make sure that they understand and can see the value in this information. So really it was starting off from a change management perspective was how do we start the culture around them valuing the evaluation information we're going to give them. We're in a world of auditors where they scrutinize every number that we provide them. So in our world, that was even more important because they were going to look at every data point that we had and say, this doesn't match what's here. Why does this different from this value? And how are you getting to this? So it was really important for us to set up, and some of you came to the afternoon session yesterday, a measurement strategy committee with business leaders from each of our clients and our key stakeholders, where we could discuss what their leaders were looking for, what the priorities were, how they needed to receive information, and what doses of information they really needed to get over time, which systems were going to help us get that information, et cetera. So it took years for us to get to where we are today, but part of it was jumping right in to learn that, hey, wait a second, we need to put the brakes on and really make sure that we are very particular about this and have a process in place where this can be successful.
Yeah, Michelle makes a great point. They did start with an ROI study, just letting you know. I'm just kidding. And I think the great point is this, I think go do it. But, you know, before you start rolling out, you need to know what you're talking about. And I think we see that a lot, too. You know, if someone does an ROI study and think, okay, that's going to cure the woes. It is not, folks. The ROI study is a demonstration of success of a program. That is what an evaluation will do for you. The question is, what are the additional information, additional data that come out of that program that could be useful to the decision makers? So again, as Michelle pointed out, have your communication strategy. Look in terms of, you know, what data do stakeholders need? What data are you giving them? What data aren't you giving them? And let's come up with the information they need. Another thing is, they're not L&D professionals, but they are the business.
Yep.
And we need to tap into their language. Don't force our language on them. They don't know the levels of evaluation, nor do they care. They know about business impact. They know if productivity improves, if quality improves, and if you get a return on investment, because return on investment is their language. If you use the right one, it's their language, not our language. So we've got to become cognizant of their language. We have to build the capacity that we can at least speak. It doesn't mean you have to be financiers, you don't, but you need to know what it means. You need to know that ROE is return on equity, not return on expectations. You need to know ROI is return on investment, not return on something else. We need to know this. What we say within our world is one thing, but when you start playing in their field, we've got to speak their language. They do know the difference between, or they do know causal analysis, cause and effect. They're going to ask you, how do you know it was your program that caused that? And if you can't explain that, what does that do for us? Nothing. They shake their heads, they pat us on the back, and they say, oh, aren't they cute? They're learning. You've got to be able to answer the questions. We've come up with 6 fundamental questions that if your measurement strategy can help you answer them, you're in pretty darn good shape. That first question is, so what? Okay, so what they build the skills, so what they're doing that. So what productivity improved? How much did it improve? How do you know it was your program that caused the results? What is it worth? What is it worth in terms of monetary benefits? What is it worth in terms of cost to the organization? How can we improve? And what are the risks if we make a change? If your measurement strategy can answer those questions, you're in good shape. The question is, do you know that? Can you do that? Can you answer those questions? And then can you communicate it to the stakeholders so they get it?
Did you get them all? Could you, one more time?
Yeah. So what? How much? How do you know? What is it worth? How can we improve? What are the risks?
Got it?
Yeah, and in addition to that, I would say your stakeholder and making sure, speaking the language of the business is really important. And I think one of the things from an evaluation perspective is get out from under kind of your stacks of papers and your analyses and get out into the field. Get an understanding also about what these folks do on a day-to-day basis, to where people talk a lot about understand the language of the business. Sometimes you have to feel what they're doing and understand what is their day-to-day operations, what are the business pressures. As an evaluator, you see them on paper and you see the statistics and you see the performance indicators and you see this, it's data. But when you go and you actually, and back when I was running measurement teams, it was, if you evaluated the effectiveness and impact and the ROI of a strategic program, you went through that program with the business unit. So they went through all of it. They went through the, kind of the storyboarding, they sat through it, and then they actually went back into the field to see how they were using this day to day, because they needed to understand there's the quantitative, there's the qualitative, and then there's the reality of what's actually happening in the world that they're going back into. And as an evaluator, a lot of times you miss that third piece, and it's critical to the analysis and that so what of talking about the, the business language and putting your results and putting kind of that, the communication strategy when you start talking back of what's the effect. A lot of times you miss what's actually just happening. You've got 2 pieces of the puzzle, but you miss that third part, which is critical to, that's your credibility also. Yeah. You have that element of credibility to where the data can tell you something. You're saying, hey, the turnover is high and your leadership is low, but what you didn't know is that they had fraud in that particular area for the last 2 months, and they wiped out everybody, and you've got a great leader and they're rebuilding. On paper, get that guy out of here. I don't want him in my, in my organization, but what they're doing in reality is a really good thing. So I would say communication, absolutely speaking the language of the business, but to get you there, get out in the field, get out of your desk, get out of the office, get into the field.
Yeah, I think that's huge. That's really, really important, because then you can pick up their language. So when you're writing your results and writing your reports and doing your presentations to them, you're using their language instead of yours. and then they're quickly bought into that conversation.
Yeah. And then you become a business partner. You're no longer, oh, that's cute.
Yeah, right.
You become part of their, their business, and they go to you. You've got data that they don't have, and that's where you create that push-pull, to where you're pushing information out. You need somebody to be pulling and kind of driving and wanting that information to make decisions, and so you need that push-pull environment, and it helps kind of create that synergy.
Yeah. And what you don't want to be is a learning and development function, or even a measurement function, folks. I mean, the same goes for your measurement process, just like any other process. You never want to be positioned as a nice to have. Isn't it nice that we have a learning and development organization? You do not want to be a nice to have.
No.
Nice to haves represent costs get cut. You want to be viewed as an investment in that organization, a must have, a need to have. And so through this change process, not only are we changing what is happening between the learning and development team and the stakeholders out here, but you're changing what's happening inside. And I think that's where it all starts. We need to take a step back. Let's look at what we're doing. If we're, we're nice to have, you might as well just get the resume ready, because they're going to tell you just how nice you are to have them around. But the same with the measurement. You don't want your measurement process or your measurement practice to be nice to have too. And we're seeing that in some organizations. Some people are saying, you know what, they look at us as a nice to have, not a need to have. That is not where we want to be.
Sure.
We want to be, measurement is part of our strategic lever. It is part of what we do. And it too is an investment. And so I challenge all of you, as you invest in metrics that matter, and as you invest in your measurement practice, go out and do an ROI study or an impact study on the investment in measurement itself. We have clients all the time do an ROI study on ROI process.
Yeah.
And the value of measurement is what people are doing with the data. Are they making decisions with your information?
Because as soon as you start to get some of those wins with those business leaders, and they start to see you as the go-to individuals for the information they need to show the value of the program or the initiative, whatever that is, they then are giving you what you need. Yeah. So when we talk about the business cases for metrics that matter or other vendors and tools, it becomes very easy because they're the ones who are coming to you saying, we need this information. You can say, well, help us get that information. Yeah. We need these tools to automate it, make it faster to get it, so that we're spending our time analyzing it and giving you your story and the impact and the results, the ROI, whatever that might be for the organization, versus, oh, hey, I went to this program, here's some information for you. I think you would like it. You want it to be the other way around, where they're coming to you, and that feeds into your cases for anything that you need in that department, because you're a valued asset in that team. You're the go-to individuals for that information that those business leaders need, versus the nice to have sitting in the back, oh, hey, I'm here, I can give you this.
Yeah, and I would say, from personal experience, and anybody who knows me knows I'm very transparent about the mistakes that I've made along my career. But I would say, and you can often get, especially with strategic programs in an evaluator position, you can get caught up in evaluating and getting into, I'm evaluating, I'm doing things, I'm analyzing, and your audience becomes, okay, it's the program level, and your instructors have your data, and we've got the process, and the technology is running, and you're not lifting your eyes up to say, who is writing my check? Who is writing my check? It is the business unit that you're doing these analyses for, and that's speaking the business language, knowing the data that they need. And we became a nice to have at one of the mortgage companies that I was with. We had a 9 IO psychologist, and we were all running a mile a minute, but we were not actually giving the data that was needed in order to make critical business decisions back up to the SVP at those timely moments. And when she went into the boardroom, we all got disseminated throughout the organization because we became black belts. We were over here. We all basically, we kind of lost our team because, and I hold myself responsible, we lost that line of sight into the executives, and we lost that line of sight of being able to hand them that information so that when they went into the boardroom, they're like, nope. You want them to say, I cannot run my business without this team. They give me information to make decisions on a daily basis, and that's where the executive reporting comes in very, very, it's critical. You can be giving your information to your instructors and your program and your content and L&D, but you've got to lift your eyes up to that 60,000 foot of who's writing the checks.
Yep, great point.
Super. Questions? With a bunch.
Yes.
Got some hands back over here.
I wanted to ask, Patty, you made a good point about maybe doing an ROI study on your ROI process. I'm wondering if you know, we ought to be drinking our own Kool-Aid first, and does that add sort of a level of credibility as we start to look at other programs? All of us probably have a slew of content and programs currently in our organizations, and so starting there to say, you know, which of these programs might be ones that we want to let go of or beef up, then when we go out to the business looking for new opportunities, if we've sort of leaned out our existing inventory of programs, does that help not only sell it to the organization, but also build some capability because we've sort of practiced behind the curtain on some of our own stuff initially?
Yeah, great question, Charles. Thanks for that question. Sure it does. Anytime you can clean your own house without somebody telling you it needs to be clean, you're in good shape. And I think you should examine your programs. You know, we get caught up in programs and we have them and they've always been around, and God, you hate to let them go because we just love them so much. But in fact, are you really adding any value by offering them? You know, anytime you can take a look at your programs and say, okay, here are all the programs that we offer. Let's look at, you know, what is the real purpose of the programs? Go back to that alignment process. You know, what is the real purpose of the programs? Well, you know, Joe has had this program for 30 years. We just can't let it go. Well, let's go talk to Joe. Say, hey, Joe, what do we really need this program? You know, and clean it up. And then you say, okay, look, we're reducing the number of programs. Let's use these resources that we dedicated to these programs and do a better job of the upfront piece. You know, that stakeholder assessment. Let's go out in the field and see what's going on. What is happening? What are the payoff opportunities for the field? You know, what measures do they need to improve? How can we move the needle? So, sure, I think it always helps your credibility when we look inside. It's better to be, I mean, it's always better to be proactive than reactive. It is always. We don't like to be because it's hard work. It's easier just to react. But why let somebody tell you what to clean up? You take a step back and look at it.
I think Patty's exactly right. And one thing that I've seen work and help organizations do that is scorecarding. Yeah. Show those trends over time in those courses. Look at registrations over time so you can see if content's gotten stale. Was this course out here 5 years ago? We had thousands of people taking it, but all of a sudden now we're down to 20 people. The scores have dropped off for it, et cetera. Who are we really targeting? Why is it still there? You can start to ask those questions once you can really look at trends over time for those courses. So I really recommend scorecarding of those programs over time so you can get a good sense of what's happening, how many people you're reaching with it. So you can ask those questions about what was the purpose of this again? Why were we offering it? Who was it intended to be offered to? Who's actually taking it, especially for e-learning courses? So I think that's a key piece that is often missed.
And I think that's a great point, Michelle, but who's taking it is the big thing. Because, you know, there are a lot of people who just like to go to training. And that's good. We all believe in development. That's good. But let's put them in something that is really useful. So looking at who is taking, so you may still have a lot of people, a lot of activity, but activity represents cost, right? So look at who's taking it. Do they really need to be taking it? Maybe there's another program that was better suited for this group, and make your adjustments.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I learned from Patty a long time ago is, I mean, it's a great exercise to sit down with your business partner and do that as well, because you should be going through your portfolio every 3 months and saying, okay, what is it intended to do? What is the objective? How should we be measuring this? Because you only have so many resources as well. So when you're mapping out where do you target an ROI study, you're not going to be doing 10 ROI studies in a year. There's just no way to pull it off.
Right.
And so you're going to be negotiating with your business unit partners to say, okay, what is it intended to do? Here's the data behind it. Does this make sense to be on our roadmap? Where should we be measuring? Is it just a knowledge transfer? Is it business impact? Or is this a heavy hitter where we need some real data behind? Yeah. And it gets to be it's a process. It becomes a process. So your needs assessment and deploying surveys and those types of things to get a pulse on the business also, it tends to go away with those conversations in conjunction with, then you have a better measurement strategy. You know your portfolio, and you're prioritizing and saying, this one doesn't make sense anymore. Let's kick it out. Not where we want to spend our time, but that exercise with your business partner, it tends to be a really rich conversation, and doing it every 3 months or every 6 months, it's not a one and done. You know, you've got to go back to it and keep revisiting these things with them, and they'll look at you and say, hey, I love this program, but here is my business need. I need you to be focusing here. And it's like, all right, so take it from 1. You want it out, or you want it at 4? Where do you want to put it on this list? You know, we only can tackle 5. So they help you prioritize, negotiate. I mean, it's a good session to have, and it helps you organize your business. So the only thing that you're focusing on from an evaluation and a learning is on the most critical priorities of that business owner, and you're constantly in their ear.
And it helps with the culture shift too, and we talked about the communication plan and change management. When you do it regularly and consistently, they'll start to look for it too, and once you can show how it's helping them weed out some of those courses, et cetera, save costs potentially, it really helps the culture change to be ready to accept that information and use it, et cetera.
Great. There was another question, I think. Yeah.
Hopefully I can get this app up. Can you
Kim,
hear
we
me?
can't hear you.
Yeah, she's,
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Oh,
Okay.
good thing.
She had a good time last
I
night.
know.
No, I sound a little like Kermit today. But so when you were talking about speaking their language, we totally get that. We're completely on board. We bought the T-shirt. But one of our challenges is that we've tried to implement TDR, and we struggle with getting beyond the effectiveness measures because our end users, they don't measure anything. It's all, they don't measure it at an individual level. And so we've really struggled. So how do we get to speaking their language? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, you don't have an outcome variable.
We've really struggled with that. We've tried it with a couple different roles. I have some ideas based on the conference on some other programs we can look at, but it's been a huge challenge to be able to get beyond that. Any ideas?
Is the struggle getting those stakeholders to define it for you, what they're expecting, or where is the challenge coming in for your group?
Challenge coming in is, I think the stakeholders, well, that's part of the challenge. The other part of the, surprise, the other part of the challenge is that, let me give you an example, maybe that will help. We tried doing a TDR study with our sales folks. We tried to get to that outcome statement. The challenge was that those outcomes aren't being measured at that individual level, so, of the sales offices. So we couldn't get to that outcome measure.
How do they measure performance? I mean, within the business unit, do they measure their performance on a, they've got operations sheets?
Performance is measured, for example, we work with client-facing roles on the phones. They're measured at client retention, but they're not measured at an individual level. They're measured at a business unit level. So how do you drill that down to one particular program? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Are we making it too hard?
you might be overthinking it a little
Yeah.
bit. If someone is measuring it, the measure's important, right? So there's a measure out there, but then at the program level, the people involved in the program are not measuring it.
Correct.
Should they be? I mean,
Well,
maybe there's your change opportunity. Because if it's
Absolutely, they should
it's
be.
important to the business unit, then it should be important to them. So is it just their inability to access the data? Is that it? Or is it they're just oblivious to the measure itself?
I think that, I absolutely think they should be. I mean, that's my opinion. I think it's crazy that they're not.
Yeah.
I think it's a matter of resources and investing the time to do that.
Well, and honestly, it poses an interesting conversation because you're not going to want to hear this, but sometimes you can't get there. And I mean, if they're not collecting the data and they're wanting you to measure at an individual level and an impact of individuals that go through the program, but they're only at the business unit level, if your data stops at the business unit level, then you go back to estimation, isolate. I mean, you've got to kind of lean on a proxy in some senses. And it does make for an interesting conversation when you get into that boardroom to say, I would love to give you impact here, but I can't. And then the next question from the executive should be, why? Why can't you get there? What's not happening? And then that's your moment of change. I mean, it's with the talent development reporting component. We've got a lot of folks that can't get the data. And some of the suggestions and some of the ways that we work with organizations is, and it sounds weird, but it's like walk into the boardroom with blanks on your report. It's a very compelling argument to where, why do I not have any data? I can't get it. Why can't you get it? They won't let me. I'm in a queue of 250 people. Can you get me up to number 2 so I can get it within the next 10 years? But it's one of those where the, blank information, no information, inability to get there it should be kind of an interesting conversation to start to be the catalyst of change. If they're really, really looking for you to do your job, I mean, it's like, you can't drive a car without a steering wheel.
And that's actually something we just did recently for the very first time. And I was a little hesitant to do it initially and say, because we had all of this great information for this initiative, and there was one particular area that they were not giving us data for it. We had nothing. We had some anecdotal information, but we had nothing else besides that. And we had this great chart and graph, and everything was filled out except for this one hole. And we did go into the meeting with a blank there because we thought that was the statement. So we went into the business leaders, we had all of the information filled in, and that spot was the empty spot. And it was great dialogue in that meeting because everyone's eyes were drawn immediately, especially, as I said, it was to auditors in our world, so they look at the numbers like, why is nothing there? So it was a great dialogue, and now we're able to move forward because they recognized, wait a second, we have these questions we need answers to, and in order for you to be able to answer them, what do you need? And that's where the conversation went to, is what do you need to get this?
Yeah, you want to keep in mind that non-response sends a strong message. No data, no improvement, but no data is a message in and of itself. It's just like when we look at our survey scores, we're so worried everyone's going to check down the middle. Well, if they all do, that's telling you something. So that's a piece of data in and of itself.
Great. Another question, sir? One more?
Sure. Hi, my name is Randy. I have a question that has to do with qualitative data, actually a twofold question. So when you make your case back to your stakeholders, right, you want to present the information that shows they're aligned, they've got, in fact, Patty, I loved your so what, how much, how do you know, all the things you want to hit. And there's tremendous amounts of quantitative data in the MTM system, but qualitatively, twofold question. Number one, what elements do you use to support the quantitative data with qualitative measures? So what are those measures? And number two, what do you consider a good balance? 90-10, quantitative to qualitative, 50-50? How would you construct an argument making that case back to your stakeholders or executives?
Yeah,
Good question.
Good question.
I think the balance part two depends on the particular program and what your outcomes are as you're trying to gather information for. I really like a balanced approach myself. We get qualitative information a couple of different ways. We get it on our surveys. So immediately after the course runs, we have a couple of open-ended questions at the end of the survey that get at very pointed questions that we want information on. So we use that to back up some of the numbers that we have in the survey. Okay, they said this area was weak. Hey, they rated it weak here too, and we can provide them with an analysis of that qualitative information to support it. But we also do observations at strategic programs. We do focus groups. We do individual interviews, and we try and use that to tell the whole picture. Because the number is just one piece of that puzzle. So we really try and get all of that other information from the key stakeholders who are part of that initiative or that program to say, here's what the result was. Here's the impact that this had. So we go at it from observations, focus groups, individual interviews, and then the qualitative data that we get immediately on our surveys as well. If we do follow-up surveys, which we have automated in our system, we also include open-ended questions there so we can get actual examples of how they implemented what they learned in that training. So we try and get the success stories immediately out too, so we have that qualitative information to balance out the numbers as well. But I think the balance really depends on the program. I can't say that's 50-50 by any means. Some programs, it might be 80% qualitative and 20% quantitative. It might be the other way around for other programs. It really depends on what you're looking for as the outcome of that program. What are you trying to measure and why are you measuring it? What's the purpose?
I think it's to how you're analyzing your qualitative data. We're seeing a huge movement in L&D and HR and other areas where we're really starting to take a serious look at qualitative data analysis. It's something we've ignored. We will look at written comments and pull out the statements that we think are most important, and they happen to be the glowing ones. Right. And that's not really qualitative data analysis. Thematic coding is an approach that we use. Another approach that we use, well, I mean, simple things like nominal group technique, we use that. I mean, that's something you're actually putting a number to, use a ranking process and a weighting process so you can move it toward the quantitative and match it up with your statistical data. I think really, this is something you guys might want to think about looking into, because it is something that's going to add value to what you're doing with your statistics, and that is really look at the qualitative data analysis opportunities. You know, in vivo coding is simple, it's not hard, but it actually gives you the quantity of the qualitative data. You're actually looking at the things that are coming out there and making meaning from those and building your story. Also, there's another technique that we use is scientific content analysis. It comes out of like criminal justice. I mean, there's a process that investigators use, but it's really a cool process where you're actually analyzing the words and you say, well, what are they missing? What are they not telling us? Which generates a new set of questions to help you go even deeper in it. So, you know, back to Michelle's point, I mean, to put, is it 90-10, 80-20? Everything depends on something else. I think our standard answer to any question is, well, it depends.
It depends.
Yeah. So I think that's hard to say, but there are tools that you can use to give you a more robust look at the qualitative to match up the quantitative. I think, too, it's culture of the organization. There are some organizations who really value the qualitative. They live in this world of qualitative, and that's good. And then they're struggling with bringing in the quantitative.
Yeah, and I mean, first of all, how much time do you have? Because it is.
Yeah.
There are qualitative analysis
tough.
tools out there that are, but it's, I mean, there's a practical component to where if you're deploying, you know, 15,000 people to go through these programs, are you going to read through every single one of those? I mean, it's time, so you have to look at the time. And so strategically, you have to decide where you want to leverage it. The second one, though, is the type of program. Executive programs, the qualitative, that anecdotal is, you know, those nuggets from those major stakeholders, one statement from some of those key players will get you your budget for the remainder of the year. I mean, so some of that anecdotal information is extremely important with some of those heavy hitter kind of executive development programs. And then the third piece, you know, when you look at your surveys and when you start thinking about what am I going to do with the data, so there's a lot of time that's spent on the front end of building surveys and building, you know, kind of what are the right questions to ask. But when you flip it onto the other side before you deploy, go through each of the different questions and kind of ask yourself, if I got information back, and I got information back on each of these different survey items, and somebody said, why is this the way that it is? Based on that information and based on the information that you're collecting at that moment, do you have enough to be able to move forward, or do you need more information and you need an explanation behind it to give you more in order to kind of create that story? So start thinking about how you're using the data, and that will oftentimes also indicate where you're going to need some kind of open-ended areas to get a level of specificity that your survey data won't get you. So your qualitative, you want to use it, I mean, use it sparingly and use it strategically based on the time allocation, but really start, I mean, we all say it, start with the end in mind, but when you go through that and you go through that kind of conversation in your head of presenting that data back, if you immediately are like, oh, I need some examples here, or I need more substance, you know, in addition to being able to do the focus groups, if you don't have the luxury, that's where you would use it.
Yeah. And I would say if you are going out to do those focus groups or interviews, make sure you have really good well-written questions.
Yes.
Make sure your stakeholders review those so that they're getting the information they need to glean from those. Make sure they're not leading questions, and make sure you have a good sampling plan in place of who you're actually going to ask those questions to. Get a good representative sample of those that participated in the program or are part of the initiative, so that you're not just singling in on the perceptions of one particular group, but you have a good sense of what the whole population had to say.
Yeah, and that's a great point. It goes back to the questions that you asked. The purpose of what you're doing, you know, qualitative data analysis, good qualitative data analysis takes a long time.
Yeah.
It does take a long time, but you don't get any better data. I mean, it can be so rich and so telling, but again, you're balancing accuracy and cost. So as Kendall pointed out, what is it you really need to do? What do you really need to influence the decisions? Another point is, if you pull out that one comment, just, you know, take care that everyone else is saying something the same, because just because one person says it doesn't mean it's true. So if you're going to rely on one person's statement, make sure it's a good, credible source of information. We see that happen quite often, and they'll pull out the one glowing comment, but the rest of the story is not. So you just have to take care of looking at that.
So, one more quick question. While you get into that, I want to ask real quick. We've thrown out some tools here. I've heard survey mentioned. I've heard can you just real quickly go across the panel? What are the essential tools in doing this effectively, of evaluating these programs, that these people have to have in their toolkit to do this?
Well,
Kendall?
what tool would you suggest, Kendall?
You know, I don't know, there's some technology out there called Metrics That Matter that tends to be just extremely useful, you know, to facilitate this exercise. You know, I was a previous client. I've known KnowledgeAdvisors before joining the company. I've known them for about 10 years and took them, you know, when I started working with Patty, I took them along with me to each of the different organizations because it allowed me to, I had a team of biopsychologists, but it allowed me to kind of keep my pulse on 98% of the, you know, programs as we were doing these deeper dives and these ROI studies and kind of, you know, that combination. So I would say that, you know, predictive capabilities, benchmarking capabilities, getting, you know, tried and true. Everybody wants to design their own survey, but why? If you've already got some predictive, you know, analytics that are in your back pocket, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and it lends itself right out of the gates to credibility. So I'm obviously a big Metrics That Matter fan. So yeah, I'd say MTM is a big one. Tools, I would also say any type of a statistical package, you know, SPSS, SAS, you know, some people can do it in Excel, and there's a new free one out there that I just ran across at a different conference. But some ability to take a deeper dive, and then Excel access, you know, being able to kind of move your data around and take it in a lot of different slices and take big data, you know, export so that you can play with it a little bit.
Yeah, anything that's going to help you automate some of the processes so that you can spend your time using the information rather than inputting it into a system or manually calculating it is going to be huge for you and your organization and what you can do for your stakeholders.
And you know, I have to say too, Metrics That Matter, and not just because I was invited to come, but if there is a tool to go with Metrics That Matter, it's not just that it gives you a great survey and it's a good survey tool, but think of the data these people have. I mean, there is no one else that has the data that KnowledgeAdvisors has through their surveys. But another tool you might look at if you go down that qualitative path, and we use qualitative, particularly on the assessment side, the needs assessment side, and then also on the explanatory side. But when you're really drilling down from an assessment, your qualitative methods is a good diagnostic tool to have. There's a tool out there that I love. It was developed for mixed methods research, but you can pull in your statistical data from KnowledgeAdvisors. You can pull those data into this system and then blend it with your qualitative data. It's a tool called Deduce, D-E-D-O-O-S-E. Great tool, not expensive. It's like $10 a month, but you only are charged when you use it. I mean, it's very inexpensive, but its intent is to blend the statistics with the qualitative. So that might be a tool that you look at. Another tool is Deduce, D-E-D-O-O-S-E. Okay. User-friendly, very intuitive, good tool to help you, blend the two data approaches or to the analysis approaches together. And then another tool I mentioned in the session yesterday is if you ever have the luxury of needing a randomization tool, or if you ever need very simple statistical tools, you don't want to go down the SPSS route, although, great program, especially for your robust analysis. But if you want something simple, there is a tool on graphpad.com, Graphpad.com. They have some statistical tools you can purchase, but go to the free tools. And that's where you can get your random numbers table, random numbers generator. They've got some of the simple statistical tools that you can use. So that's a good resource that we use sometimes. And then another tool that, what is the tool? Oh man, I forgot the name of it. It's another free tool on data visualization of data visualization tool. And I cannot remember, I think it's GEPHI. It's free. And then there's another cool tool out there. You'll have to Google it because I don't know the name exactly. But what I like about this tool, it doesn't do anything for you. It just gives you pretty pictures. But it's but it helps you think through how to display data, because data visualization is a huge thing. I mean, if you can put it in meaningful pictures, you forget all the words and the numbers, put it in a picture, and we're good to go. And it's a data visualization. It's, what is it called, the chemistry thing? Where it had the, Thank you. Periodic table data visualization. That's it. Look it up. It is really a cool tool. And you scroll over the different types of displays and it'll give you examples and all that. So that's another free one for you.
Yeah, data viz, Stephen Few is a good one for data visualization, for the expertise, and it is becoming kind of big of how do you get that information as quickly as possible for your consumer. And so Stephen Few is a good one to follow.
Stephen Few is really good.
Yeah.
And then Edward Tufte is another one who's really good. We all know him. He does not like PowerPoint, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's good. Both of those. There's a lot of good work there.
I would also say on the front end, when we talk a lot about just the logic modeling and spending time with your stakeholders, getting a mind mapping tool. So Peggy Parsky actually is the person who kind of brought us into the mind mapping world, and it's actually amazing the type. So MindJet or looking at the mind mapping, but as you're facilitating these discussions with your stakeholders on the front end, so not on the back end, but on the front end, you need something to organize those thoughts and organize those kind of key themes. But the mind mapping tools are amazing, and aesthetically it allows your group, whomever you're actually doing these facilitations with on your business side, they can see as you're doing it and as you're kind of going through each of the different kind of groups and trends, and I mean they follow along well. It's good through the webinars. It's really easy to follow. So a mind mapping tool is also very critical when you get into strategic programs and that front end of the that cycle when you're really defining what your outcomes are.
Yeah, and we've actually used mind mapping, MindJet in particular, but there are a lot of other tools out there. We've actually used mind mapping to analyze qualitative data. Did a project for our clients. Great way to break the data down, look at it, different approaches.
We have one quick question because we're almost at our time, but sir.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Henry Finkbottle.
Henry, how are you?
Thank you for joining us.
I'm very concerned about the value of training, as we all are, and our distinguished panel has given us a number of great ideas, and there's just one other small point I'd like to offer for your consideration. It has to do with how do you predict the value of training before the training takes place. And it comes from some experimental work done by Nick Bontis at McMaster University in Canada. You can look him up on the web, Bontis. And he did a study of what is the greatest predictor of value for a training event. He looked at 3 elements. One is the content of the program. The second is the qualifications of the presenter. And the third is the perception of the trainee as to the value of this program for them. And what he found, and some of you already know because your heads are bobbing up there, that the greatest predictor is the perception of the trainee that this is going to be useful to them in their career. So bringing it down to the ground, one way to deal with that perhaps is to, of course, go out and find out ahead of time if the person who's coming for the training feels that they ought to come and that it's going to be valuable. But practically speaking, if you're training 1,000 people, you can't go out and do that one at a time. But you could put it in the program message that says, here's this program on whatever, and in terms of considering who should attend, either the trainee should do this or the supervisor of the trainee should do this, is look at this in terms of the perceived value of the person who's coming. Is this the right thing for them, the right time in their career, et cetera, et cetera. And that might help weed out some of the people who are predictably going to fail at this because it's of no use to them. The quality of the program is good, but they're the wrong people at the wrong time. So just something to think about ahead of time.
Great. Let's thank our panel for their wonderful insight. And you'll be around for questions beyond as well, I'm sure. So thank you.